welcome to anyone who entered into the project management session, and really excited to shift gears from the identifying strong barrier removal projects to how are we going to pay for all of these projects. So we have Ron Rhodes from the Connecticut River Conservancy, who has worked on lots 29 barrier removal projects through his time. He's been with Connecticut River Conservancy since 2011. And welcoming Michele Braun, who has been with the Friends of the Winooski River for the past 7 years. And while maybe focused so far on 2 dam removal projects, 2 barrier removal projects, the latter, involved with dozens of funding sources to accomplish those removals. And so really looking forward to hearing from both of you, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm Michele Braun with Friends of the Winooski River, and I am super excited to be talking with Ron today because Ron introduced me to dam removal in 2017 at a WOV conference presentation, and he had a slideshow that showed things blowing up, which turned out not to be true. And Corey Miller from the Basin Program was watching that presentation, and everything that Ron said cracked her up, and she has a great laugh, and I was like, this looks awesome. I totally want to do this. So here we are. So we are going to mention a lot of funding sources. We're not going to get really into the nitty-gritty of them because they are constantly changing. And of course, right now, there's an even greater level of uncertainty than usual. So you should, I guess, we keep hearing about partnerships and communication, and that's going to keep going throughout the day. But in terms of the details of grants and their priority and timing and reporting requirements and that kind of thing, those are conversations that you need to be having all the time with your funders as to the mechanics of how grants work. And so we're not really going to talk about that. So, as Lynn said, I've only managed to complete 2 barrier removal projects. So it's a little funny that I'm here to talk to you about funding. But I have been working on fundraising for a long time. This is a photo of me from the Carter administration. And
Who?
Y'all can Google that when you get home. And we had sheep. My parents were very happy about that. And they also had a really inadvisable number of chickens. I was not particularly interested in either sheep or chickens. I wanted a pony, obviously. And in order to get the pony, I had to demonstrate my animal husbandry skills by taking care of the chickens, which gave me the opportunity to deal with a lot of eggs. Every Sunday, I loaded the eggs into my little red wagon, and I went around and I knocked on all the neighbors' doors for 4 miles up and down the road trying to sell these eggs. And it took probably 3 years of really hard work to get the pony, and I did. And this is relevant because it takes the same thing for dams. You have to keep asking and ask everybody you know and knock on all the doors, and it's going to take years to get to the first project. So that's my lesson. Ron?
You want me to go?
Uh-huh.
All right. I don't know. What am I supposed to say now?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, they've already introduced you. Ron Rhodes, Director of Programs, Connecticut River Conservancy. As Lynn said, I did my first dam removal in 2024. I've done 23 dam removals and 6 culverts. You see the numbers, right? Culverts are great projects, but there's nothing more fun than a dam removal. Who here has not yet had the pleasure to be involved in a dam removal project? All right. It's fucking awesome. You're going to love it. Get one. Partner with someone so you don't have to do all of this work, right? Because it does take time. Sometimes they can be frustrating, but there is nothing more enjoyable from a project manager standpoint than a dam removal. Right, Emily? I hope that's what we take out of this conference, right? Is that everybody here goes out and tries to find a dam removal project. It may take you 8 years or 3 years, right, to make it happen. And culverts are a little bit easier, but sometimes culverts actually cost more. And sometimes. Culverts cost more because you got to buy a culvert or buy a bridge, as Mary left. As Mary said, right, a bridge is going to cost you $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. You're not buying a dam. Right? You're taking out a dam and you return the river to its natural state. So,
if we're not buying it, why does it take so much money?
A lot of hoops. Anyways, let's proceed.
Yeah, so in the last 7 years at Friends of the Winooski River, I've had 24 grants related to aquatic organism passage, and that has resulted in 2 barriers being removed. We have a lot of projects in design right now, so that explains some of this. These are color-coded, so the yellow is federal, the green is state, which is secretly largely federal, and the blue is local or private funds. So why is it so expensive? Partly it's because the phases have to be funded separately. Not always, not all projects, but typically this is kind of the flow of our engagement on projects, and it's a stepwise process. Not all the grants support all aspects of the project. For example, staff time for our role along the way is not always part of the grant. So you have to let people know that you need money for staff time. So for instance, Gianna Petito is here, and she was at the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District, now where Dan is, and she wanted to go look at some culverts. And I said, I don't have any money to spend all day tramping around Williamstown looking at culverts. Where would I get money for that? And so Gianna said, well, I probably have enough money for both of us. And so she made a little sub-award to us for, $2,000 or something. But it enabled us to go out and spend the day in the field. So ask, and let people know what you need. Also, there are the funders' goals. They need to manage their risk. They can't put all of their funding into one project that may or may not succeed. They want to support a lot of different organizations, and they want to have impact across whatever their territory is, whether it's a county or a conservation district area or the whole state or all of New England. They are people too, and they have similar obligations to us to their own funding sources to demonstrate accomplishments and show compelling metrics. Also, barrier removal is really costly. For feasibility or preliminary design, it can be $10,000 to $20,000. Final design, $70,000 to $110,000. Implementation, Ron says he has done an implementation for $50,000.
I've done one for less than that.
With some shovels.
By hand.
Yeah.
It wasn't a very big dam.
Up to $1.5 million. And culvert replacements are a little simpler than dams, sometimes can be, and maybe you can do final design all in one grant, $50,000 plus, and implementation for $100,000 to $1 million. And one thing about this phased situation is that you need to be looking ahead and looking at the timelines for the grants that are coming out, and be talking to the funders about when they anticipate funding may come out. Because you might imagine that you need to complete preliminary design, have that design in hand, and then apply for final design. But these projects already take long enough. And so you need to be looking for your final design funding while you're still doing preliminary design, and you need to be looking for your implementation funding sometimes while you're still in feasibility. And it gets a little hairy and high-wiry. You also have to be ready for surprises and know where you might be able to find little extra bits of money in case it turns out that your dam that was supposedly not jurisdictional actually does need a $3,000 dam order, or the Department of Historic Preservation really needs you to do some investigation, or there are bats and you have to get the trees cut down now, not 3 months from now when that other grant is going to be available. So it's tricky.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
So Mary and Keith and David didn't really talk about this in prioritization, but I would suggest for those folks that raised their hand and said they have not yet been involved in a project, don't pick $1 million dam removal as your first project. There's a lot of small dams out there, right? There are $50,000 projects, that can be done in 2 or 3 years. The fastest I've ever done a project was 2 years. Usually I say it's 3 to 5, right? But just pick a small dam that's in someone's backyard on a small tributary. That's a hell of a lot easier for your first project as a project manager, as opposed to a dam that's got a culvert downstream or upstream that needs to be replaced and a dry hydrant. And, let those complicated ones be, year 5 or number 5 that you do. There's some low-hanging fruit out there.
Although if the person with the $1 million dam calls you and says, please help us with this dam, be smarter than I am and say, no, I need to start with a small project. So I work in the Lake Champlain Basin, and Ron works in the Connecticut River watershed. So I can tell you about Lake Champlain Basin program funding. For folks in the Medford-Magog, the Hudson, and wherever else, some of these will hopefully still be relevant. So these are your general federal, state, and private funders. And each of them may manage multiple relevant funding programs. So like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has Partners for Fish and Wildlife, National Fish Passage Program, Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture. The Basin Program has a new very specific aquatic organism passage program, but you can also apply for barrier removal projects through the Clean Water and Healthy Ecosystems grant. You may also want to do like interpretive signage at your dam removal project, and then you could apply for a small education and outreach grant from the Basin Program. Watersheds United Vermont has the enhancement Enhancement Design and Implementation Block Grant and a specific dam removal block grant. Vermont Fish and Wildlife has a state wildlife grant, habitat stamp grant, and watershed grants, which are the money that comes from the conservation license plates. The first grant that I had for a dam, the organization already had when I started working there. And Will Eldridge from Fish and Wildlife said, hey, I just started at Fish and Wildlife and I'm looking at these grants that we have out, and you guys have a grant, and it's $30,000 and it needs to be spent in the next 60 days on a fish passage project. Go. And that has been kind of my relationship with Fish and Wildlife for 7 years, where many times now I have gotten, hey, I have $30,000 and 60 days to spend it. You ready? And that's really handy for those unexpected expenses that come up. But just all of these funding sources have their quirks. One that's not mentioned on here is the Whisper program. I don't know if anyone has. It's real, Ron. It's real. If anyone has actually used it or heard about it.
Has anyone used it?
I'm going to, I swear. The state of Vermont Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund has set up a mechanism whereby you can extract funding for natural resources projects when a community does a big infrastructure investment project, like a wastewater treatment facility upgrade or a new water main or something like that. I am totally using that money in 2026, yep. And municipalities and landowners occasionally pitch in too. Like municipalities may have ARPA funds they can contribute or other more flexible funding, but you need to ask them. That's another possible source for when you run into like, we really have to get these trees down. None of the grants that we have right now are going to cover that. Go to the town and say, hey, could you cover this expense? That's a good approach with towns, I think, is if you have a concrete, discrete expense, they can help with that. So that's the basin.
All right. Welcome to Vermont's East Coast, the Connecticut River watershed. I'm dating myself by using the Big Lebowski. Some of you may know it, but maybe not. So a lot of the funding sources that we have are the same as, the statewide or national programs that Michele talked about. So one thing here, the italic funding sources can be both dams and culverts, and the ones that are not in italic, like State of Vermont, WUV, dam removal design and implementation, the name sort of tells you it's a dam removal grant, not a culvert replacement grant. So you do have to sort of keep track of, which funding source will fund what. We have some unique funding sources on our side. The hydro dams, 15-Mile Falls, they had to go through a federal relicensing process, 15, 20 years ago. So as part of getting that federal license for those hydro dams, they had to put $15 million into a restoration grant program. It's administered by the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. But that grant helped pay for some of those dam removals you heard Mary talking about. It's helped pay for most of our dam removals from the White River north in Vermont. It's a great source of funds, but it's also limited. It's probably going to run out of funds in 2 years. The other ones I want to point out, I'm going to have another slide about some of these other federal funds. But USDA, NRCS, Matt and I were just talking about a new project. Any dam that's privately owned or on private property can potentially be funded through Natural Resource Conservation Service, right? Usually we work with them on farm projects, but they can do dam removals. That's a practice that they fund. So we did a dam removal in Windham that Vermont Fish and Wildlife actually brought to us and said, would you help this dam owner? Because it was a great brook trout stream, but these two earthen dams that someone had built to create, ponds on their property are at the very top of the watershed. So from a miles perspective, aquatic organism passage miles, right? It was like a quarter of a mile. So Vermont Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife were like, we can't really fund it because you're not opening enough miles. But by removing those dams, we were lowering the water temperature. If you do those temperature data that David was talking about, and sometimes the dams are increasing water temperature downstream by 16 degrees. So you're looking at 63 degrees above the dam, great brook trout water, to 79 degrees below the dam. Lethal brook trout water, right? So great project, but not a project that one of our usual brook trout funders could help us with. So we went through NRCS, and the landowner signed an EQIP contract, Environmental Quality Insurance Program or something like that. I'm close, right? anyways, farmers work with NRCS all the time. They can work with private landowners, any producer, forestry, et cetera. I've done work on my property with NRCS, so you don't have to be a farmer. So that's a really great resource. They've got a lot of money. They've got the RCPP, Regional Conservation Partners Program grant. TNC got one in Vermont. We've had TU, us, TNC, and somebody else were doing dam removals through that for the last 5 years. We just got one in New Hampshire, $11.5 million grant for 5 years. Now, it's not for dam removals per se, it's for all the work, right, that NRCS will fund. But so there is money in the system to help do dam removals on private property. What else is different? Dave mentioned it down at the bottom. So right now, of course, towns have ARPA money. We've gotten money from towns to help fund those sort of harder, everybody wants to fund the dam removal, right? Because that's the sexy part. It's harder to find someone to pay the engineer $70,000 to do the design. So ARPA funds have been helpful in that respect. Trout Unlimited, Dave mentioned them in his presentation earlier. We have 6 Trout Unlimited chapters in Vermont. They all have some money. I'm involved in our Upper Valor chapter, and we've helped fund White River Partnership projects before. Those chapters can also apply for an Embrace a Stream grant from Trout Unlimited National. I chair that committee. We give out $10,000 grants to chapters to do work like dam removals or tree plantings or whatever. So there's partners that have capacity to bring some, not huge amounts of money, but amounts of money that can be used for staff time or engineering or historic preservation work. Patagonia, 1% for the Planet, Conservation Alliance, right? A lot of our, not a lot, but some of our Vermont companies are part of 1% for the Planet or the Conservation Alliance. Darn Tough Socks, right? They're a Conservation Alliance member. If they sponsor your program or your project, you can apply for grant funding from the Conservation Alliance. We just did the Blake Higgins Dam removal in the Saxons River in Westminster this past year, and they gave us $30,000 towards that project. Very flexible funding. Sometimes funding has, pretty strict restrictions on how you can use their funds. And some of these foundations have a little broader scope. The other one that we use a lot is National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So Long Island Sound Futures Fund is one of their grants. Again, ton of money in that. It's a it's a regional grant, so it's hard to get all of what you might ask for. I think we applied for 4 different grants this year, and we got 2. So you're not going to get every application you submit, right? I think if I, have a $400,000 project and I submit 10 grants, and maybe it's, going to total like $600,000 or $800,000 because I'm hoping I get half of those grants that I apply for. Every once in a blue moon, you'll get lucky. I had this problem this year with Blake Higgins. I had too much money. We still have too much money. I got to talk to some grant funders about, well, if we don't spend all that, what are we going to do? Because you can only plant so many trees, and when you put it out to bid, all of your grant writing has been based on your opinion on probable cost from your engineer when they've done their design work, and say, okay, we need $400,000, and then you put it out to bid, maybe the bids come in low, right? That's happened. We come in and we get, all of a sudden it's $150,000 less than we thought it was going to be. Now that doesn't always happen, but it does happen occasionally. So NFWF, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, if you're on the eastern side of Vermont, the other Long Island Sound Futures Fund, but also the New England Forest and Rivers, which is broader than just the Connecticut River now. They're funding projects and dam removals, culverts. I know Trout Unlimited has gotten funding from them just to do some of their work. So you've got the local, the state, the national, and then the other category where there's family foundations out there, right? There's regional foundations that are looking for projects to fund. This is a thing from American Rivers. It might be hard to see, but it just goes into some of those federal, national, like NOAA, right? So if you have migratory fish, like in our watershed, and I know all of you in the Lake Champlain region, don't freak out, I'm going to say sea lamprey, because they're native in our side of the state. They're not an invasive. So NOAA will fund a dam removal for sea lamprey passage, right? Or shad passage. So those migratory fish, and there's a lot of money in that system. And in theory, should continue to be. No one exactly knows what's going to happen in a month or so. But they've had money for years, and so in theory, they're going to continue. Michele already mentioned the National Fish Passage Program. FEMA has dam removal money. I don't know if you want to go there.
I want it. Ask
It's
Karina.
a source.
Is Karina here?
It's a source, it's a potential source, but it comes with a lot of paperwork. Let's call it paperwork. Army Corps of Engineers, Section 206. I have not used this yet, but they have dam removal. Now, their main focus is on dams that they own, right? So they've got obviously active flood control dams, but they've also got a lot of old dams that are no longer in use. And so their main focus is on that. But you could talk to Angela and the other Army Corps staff here in Vermont or New York and potentially get money from the Army Corps of Engineers. And U.S. Forest Service. So they can help fund projects. Trout Unlimited does a lot of work with the U.S. Forest Service. I don't think Aaron Rogers is here, but Aaron's a good person to know. Great partner, Trout Unlimited, both the local chapters who are volunteers and the national staff like Aaron. They work with U.S. Forest Service on the Green Mountain National Forest, and any stream that trickles off of the forest down into the Deerfield River and into the Connecticut, they can help fund those projects too. It doesn't actually have to be within the boundaries of the Forest Service.
They have kind of a doctrine that I keep trying to remember the name of, but one of the projects that I have completed, a culvert removal in the Mad River Valley, used Forest Service money. I kept having to check. I'm like, you guys do know that this culvert is not in the forest, right? But its very, very, very top headwaters were close enough. So. Yep.
So that's another potential federal source that should still be available, you know, in the future. All right. How many grants do you need, right? So that little one on the top left, that's the one we did by hand. I had 2 grants, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Now, it's not much of a barrier, but it is a barrier in low flows. So we had U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and that mitigation fund, the new Upper Connecticut River Mitigation Fund. So that's up in West Barnet? No, that's not right. West Burke. And we took a jackhammer and some pry bars, and we removed a dam, right? And it was pretty simple. It was 3 of us that worked for like 3 days. That one, I don't know, maybe that cost $10,000, you know? That's not usual. And down bottom right is Mount Snow. Now, it's not really a dam, although we call it a dam. It's a road with 2 culvert pipes. But it's a dam removal. Mount Snow has to do it as part of their stormwater plan. You can get into Act 250 issues. You know, it can get a little more complicated. But that's probably going to be $1.5, $1.6 million dam removal. Maybe it happened in 2027. we're going to have probably a lot of different grants for that project, right? Because 1.5 million, even if the dam owner, Mount Snow, puts in half of it, you're still going to need a lot of funds. And you're not going to find someone to give you $1 million. You're going to find 100,000 from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and 50,000 from Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and maybe WOV, you get a dam removal grant for 150 or 200,000, and so you end up having to cobble together different sources. So that's why I always say, it could be 1 to 8. I would say on average we end up with about 4 or 5 grants funding each project.
Phase?
Good point. Michele said per phase. The way I think about it is whoever helps fund the engineering is going to help fund the removal, right? They're already bought in. So if I get $50K from some foundation or grantor for engineering, I'm locking them in for removal money. Now the question is, how much can I get from them, right? Can I pry 200, 250 out of them? Because you're already in, you've already spent money on this project. So that's great, right? If you have those early funders, and then you can just sort of assume they're in for the long haul. So yes, it might be several grants, but it's from the one funding source.
It's more like funding sources.
Right.
Yeah.
So you might get one grant for design and then a second one from for construction, but it's the same funder. So. Michele asked me to put this one in, partnerships, communication. So we've done this little dam removal, I don't know what you call it. It's a PDF. We have it on our website, and it just goes through our history of, I did my first dam removal in 2014, and so we kind of go by year. And the before and after pics are great, right? Funders like that when you're submitting your final grant report, right, Toby? Like that before and after is awesome. Make sure you take the picture from the same spot, right? Like looking upstream, because it's really confusing when you take one from the side and then one from the, looking upstream or downstream. So some of this is communication and PR related. And thank your funders, right? I can't tell you how important that is when you do a press release or when you do a social media post. And sometimes we have a communications director and she's like, that's an awful long list. And I'm like, yep, but we got to do it, right? Because they gave us $100K for this dam removal. And they're not going to give us $100K for the next one if we don't talk about them, as often as we can. I don't know that there's much else to share in there. So 2014, we did 3 dam removals and 1 culvert project. So it was a busy summer. Luckily, I'm not the only one. We've got other staff. I went to the Dudleyville Pond is in Massachusetts. I went to that one day. Someone else was the project manager on that. But if you really get into this and get addicted to it, like I am, you will find yourself driving from Saxon's River in Vermont, which is in Westminster, right? About almost as far south as you can go, up to North Stratford, New Hampshire, which is damn near in the Canadian border, which I don't even remember, 3.5 hour drive, and you'll find yourself doing that in the same day because you have to be at both project sites. So I think we're ready to move on. How are we doing on time?
We're at 35 after, and maybe by in 10 minutes you're going to want to move to questions.
Okay.
If that works.
Perfect.
Is that my last slide, Michele?
It is.
Awesome.
So we've talked about a lot of different funding sources. So how do you figure out which ones are the right ones to go with your project? I think, as we've mentioned, you need multiple funding sources per project. So for those folks who were here earlier this morning and saw the diagram that Keith and Dave Minkoff both showed about, great projects versus project opportunities and sort of the spectrum. There are a lot of factors. There are so many different benefits of removal, and the benefit of a particular removal So any one dam removal is going to have like all those benefits to some degree. Every culvert removal is going to have all those benefits to some degree. And so you can kind of sell any barrier removal project to any funder because they're going to have the benefit the funder's looking for to some degree. But definitely some of them are going to be much stronger on one metric than on another. They're going to remove more miles, or they're going to lower temperature, or they're going to improve geomorphic compatibility and have a clean water benefit. So looking at the benefits of the project is really helpful to matching to funding, especially in the early phases of a project. It tells you who to be talking to. And so that's why it's really important to be talking with your AOP team. Dave Minkoff talked about the Missisquoi AOP team. In our watershed, we also have an AOP team. I think other watersheds do as well. Talking with your partners on your team about the benefits that they see, and talking to the engineer during the feasibility study about really clearly identifying what they think the benefits of the project will be so that you can match it with funding. That's going to, Ron was saying, if those, if this funder pays for design, I want to see them carry through to implementation. But it has happened that a funder could pay for preliminary design and you get through to a certain point and realize, actually, this isn't really a great fit for our goals. And so you have to shift. So it's really important to be clear about what the benefits of the project are. Other factors that can come into play are the location. We talked about, being close to the national forest. In a brook trout patch, U.S. Fish and Wildlife is going to prioritize brook trout only patches. Vermont Fish and Wildlife, wild trout, so more species of trout they're happy to make habitat for. But U.S. Fish is going to, be looking at brook trout habitat over habitat that includes other species. If Vermont Fish and Wildlife has identified a subwatershed as a priority because it generally has good habitat, that's a good one. More often we're seeing, is it in a disadvantaged community? The Lake Champlain Basin Program has a map of identifying disadvantaged communities, and that's going to be a potential factor in accessing funds. Then there's the dam's hazard condition. Is it a high hazard dam? Is it in poor condition? Is the flood resilience benefit really important? Any dam removal is going to lower flood elevations, but is it going to lower flood elevations in a way that makes a difference? Is what you're looking for the flood resilience benefit. Ownership may determine what funding you can use. If it's owned by VTrans, you cannot use clean water funds. So there are some lines. And then if it's an historic structure, that just kind of complicates things. But it also potentially taps you into like the Basin Program historic and cultural resource area of funding. So you've got to be thinking about all of these things as ways to connect your project with funding.
The only thing I would add is rely on your partners, right? You can go through all of those prioritization tools and you can spend, God knows how many hours. Or what I do, when Matt sent me an email the other day about a potential dam removal project, I sent it to a long list of state and federal partners. And I said, what do you guys think? And let them tell you, right, if it's a good fit for their funding source.
I did that yesterday too.
Because everybody here wants to get that dam out. Now, it may not be a great fit for U.S. Fish or Vermont Fish, but somebody else on the list is going to say, yeah, we're in, So use that partnership and that communication to your advantage, because I don't know about you guys, I don't have time to go all of those prioritization tools and try to figure out what Dave was talking about and filter out the wrong thing. I can barely use the Vermont Atlas, which is fairly easy to use.
keep knocking on doors, keep
Yeah.
asking questions.
They will help you.
Oh, this got all messed up again. It was better aligned before. I don't know what happened. Yeah, so including ask us, send us an email. Ask, hey, how did you pay for that? Who should I be talking to? So we have a couple examples. This is the first and still only dam that Friends of the Winooski River has removed in my tenure, the Camp Weacowie Dam. As I said, I started with a state wildlife grant from Vermont Fish and Wildlife that needed a non-federal match, so I got a Vermont Community Foundation grant. Vermont Community Foundation is awesome. Then a DEC Ecological Restoration Program grant, which is what clean water funding used to be called, for preliminary design. Then our friends at Vermont Natural Resources Council, I said, I didn't know we had to do this historic preservation stuff. What? And they said, well, we have a basin program grant that can support other partners, and so they paid for the historic preservation. U.S. Fish and Wildlife National Fish Passage Program covered the permitting costs. And then we had another state clean water grant for final design. So that was 6 funding sources to get through from identifying the dam to final design. For implementation, we had U.S. Fish and Wildlife funding from NFPP. We had an Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture grant, and I said we wouldn't talk about nitty gritty, but the RFP just came out for Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture. It's only $50,000, and you don't get it until 18 months after you apply for it, at least. So it's a little funky, but it's $50,000. So if you have a project that's good for brook trout, it's a good source. And then Partners for Fish and Wildlife helped with both technical assistance and funding for the restoration, the tree planting stuff. Again, VNRC came through with sharing their basin program funding with us. More state clean water funds, because things were different then in terms of the clean water benefit calculation. The Nature Conservancy was excited about this project, and so they contributed funding. Although this project was constructed in 2020, and so the Nature Conservancy had been planning to give us a substantial amount of funding. But in the spring of 2020, they had to reevaluate their priorities. And so but they still decided to support this project when we were able to make it happen. Watersheds United Vermont gave us woody buffer funding for the trees and pure projet funding for the trees. Don't even think about that, it's over now. And we had volunteers who planted the trees. So that came out to, including the volunteer labor, 15 different grants for that dam. We then moved on to, because one dam was really cool, why not do 3 at once? So this is the Stevens Branch running through the city of Barre. We're working on 3 dams on the Stevens Branch. The most upstream one is Jockey Hollow. We are just getting close to finishing final design, and we have had 6 grants for that one, for final design. For implementation, we have applied to National Fish Passage Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Funds. Our project was ranked first in the region, the Northeast region, but didn't get funded anyway. Sad story. We applied for an EPA Community Change grant that we're still waiting to hear from. That's a one-time opportunity. No one has any idea what the likelihood of funding is. We do have a WUV dam removal grant for implementation, and we've applied for a basin program, clean water and healthy ecosystems grant. This is the middle one, HABEP, and that's the one that I'm absolutely using WSPR funding for in 2026. This is Brooklyn Street. It is attached to a factory where the same family has been making stone cutting tools since the 1830s or something like that. It's on the national, or they're working on getting it on the National Historic Register. That's not complicating things at all. It's totally cool. This is the East Calais Mill Dam, and you can see something happened there in July of 23, and the landowners contacted us for help. We have, for this, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I called Julie, our partner at U.S. Fish, and said, hey, these people need help. Can we get a feasibility study going? She said, sure, use our money. So that was great. We've got a feasibility study. We now have a basin program grant that is also paying for 2 culverts that I completely forgot to put in here. But we have 2 culverts in design right now with that same funding. Again, that's historic. It's also, the pond is like the focal point of the village. So folks in the village are pretty nervous and uncomfortable about losing the pond. But it's obviously there's a little safety situation happening here. And the landowners, the community would like the landowners to repair the dam. But repairing dams is even more fantastically expensive than removing them. So you can't compel the landowner to repair them. That's crazy. Clark Sawmill Dam in Cabot is something that Friends of the Winooski's been working on since well before I started there. But the landowner didn't want the dam to be removed because he had a fantasy about low head hydro. So in 2023, the dam removed itself, and it's not exactly a dam removal project anymore. It kind of still is, in that like all of the mill building stuff is still there, the abutments are still there, but there's no AOP benefit here. And I hope maybe Watersheds United Vermont enhancement money can help us clean up that. Maybe basin program enhance clean water and healthy ecosystems, we'll see. And then in Plainfield, they have a dam right in the village. And they, after the flooding in 23, asked us for help to do a feasibility study. And both State of Vermont and U.S. Fish and Wildlife were so excited about this project because it's the only dam on the main stem of the Winooski in the headwaters above where all the hydro dams are, that they both wanted to fund it. And I was like, guys, it's only going to be like $10,000. You really both need to put in $5,000? Okay, well, we can do that. But then it turned out that it's actually a structurally really complicated project. The feasibility study turned out that it was going to be a lot more expensive than that. And Vermont Community Foundation said, hey, we really want to help you guys with flood response, but we can't give money to you for your staff time. Back to that again. But we would love to give you some money to pay engineers to do work in places that have had flooding. Okay, so that's super specific, but sure, we can do that. And so that is going toward the feasibility study as well. So we have 3 sources of funding for just a feasibility study. You just never know. And then we're trying to help the town apply to FEMA for funding for design and implementation. And the reason that we're choosing the FEMA funding for this one is essentially to reduce the pressure on all of the other funding sources that we want to try to use for all of the other dams. So we could use, our fish partners are excited about this, we could potentially use fish money on it, but we kind of need to save the fish money for the other projects that aren't going to be able to access the FEMA money. So it's a constant kind of juggle of evaluating, like the East Calais Dam with the big pond and the damage from 2023. It's not a fantastic fish project because the whole system is a little bit warm. It will lower the temperature, which is great, but it's just not it's not an all-star in that category. So the town is applying for FEMA funding for that one too. So lots and lots of considerations.
I always say it's like a giant puzzle, right? Like you're on vacation, it's raining all day, you get the puzzle out and you start finding those pieces and put them in the right places. That's fundraising and grant writing for dam removals.
And it's eventually worthwhile because it's the opposite.
Thank you both so much. And I think, juggling, puzzles, perseverance, that seems to be like that time scale, and thinking at that time scale to get this work done and piecing together all those different funding sources. So thank you for doing that work.
We definitely have a running spreadsheet that's, out to 2028, which projects are in which phases and how are we going to fund them through those years.
So we have time for a couple questions.
Yeah.
Ira.
I'm just curious, like these grants have deadlines, they have timelines associated with them, and how do you go about matching those to the sequence of the project? If the project might take years to develop and you have money for 60% design right now, but you can't actually get to that by the time the grant ends. I mean, or is this not, just a spreadsheet solve this issue?
I would say that's part of the juggling act, right? So you get the folks that say it needs to be spent by September 30th because that's the end of the federal fiscal year. And so you say, okay, we're going to spend it all on engineering because that's where we're at right now. Mm-hmm. Then you get the other grant that's maybe a year, but you can probably get an extension, right? Because you've worked with that grant funder before. And so you go, okay, it's a year grant, but it's really 2. So we're going to save that money for the implementation costs, right? But it is definitely part of the project management side of it and the juggling act of which funding sources to use first. Like something like the Conservation Alliance or, one of those grants, you get a little more flexibility. State and federal grants are a little more prescribed and less likely to get those extensions.
Yeah, you'd have to just be very cognizant all the time of how that's going to go. And you might forget sometimes because somebody might tell you got to spend the money by September 30th, and then other things happen and you need to spend that money, but you forgot you were supposed to spend somebody else's money, and then you're in a situation and you call the engineers and you're like, hey, engineers, come on, we got to spend money. And then you call Lynn and say, is there any chance that the grant that you have for this project could be extended? And Lynn absolutely saves the day. You can call the engineers back and say, don't panic, it's okay. That grant can go long. I don't have to spend it right now. But it's a constant process of reevaluating where you are and what your deadlines are.
And I also just note, spending money is different than having a final product. Right? I can get an engineer to send me an invoice for final design, $70,000. I don't need the report by September 30th.
It depends on the grant, Ron. It depends on the grant.
So that's another little trick of the trade is what do they want in the final report, right? Is it a copy of the invoice? Done.
Yeah.
Is it a copy of the final design with a stamp on it? Yeah.
Back to that juggling, and and the partnerships between the funders and the folks doing the work as well, and as to what's needed. We have time for one more question. So,
Michele, you mentioned having a spreadsheet out to 2028. Are there steps that your organizations are taking to be proactive and/or safeguard yourselves from the many what-if scenarios that could play out over the next 4 years?
We're definitely just generally looking at it as, we had a slide about that, but we decided not to get into it because it's so speculative right now. But we're definitely aware of the fact that there could be a shift away from big public investment in these and more toward philanthropy. And also a necessity to be putting smaller projects in the pipeline right now. That's what I'm thinking.
And Matt, I would just say, in the past, right, when there was all this money in the system, I've lost dam removals before, right? Because they take 3 to 5 years. One of the dam owners we were working with sold their house and retired to Florida, and the new owner of the house wasn't interested in dam removal. We had spent $90,000 on engineering design on that project, right? I had another one, it was in New Hampshire, but the couple I was working with, the wife got cancer. All of a sudden, dam removal really wasn't a priority for them. Now, luckily, she survived and recovered, and we went on with the project. But imagine if, right, something had changed for that family, like your spouse dying. Dam removal wouldn't have been, an option at that point. We lost another one where we were going to remove the dam and build a rock ramp, and Vermont decided that would be a dam in the new dam safety regulations and the rules, right? So we spent $70,000 on design with Interfluve, and we thought we had a project that was fundable, and then all of a sudden it was like, well, no, that rock ramp is a dam. You're going to need an emergency pipe flow. You're going to, like all the things. I'm like, wait a minute, it's a pile of rocks. It's not a concrete. So we lost that project because, again, we'd have to have an owner, all the stuff of. So it's possible to lose projects even without, uncertain funding in the future. So that's what I've always said. We do as many dam removals as we can every year, because 5 years from now, 10 years from now, who knows, right? We may be doing rain gardens. Right now there's money in the system, and strike while the iron is hot.
And for the next couple years, I think through 26 we're solid, but who knows?
Yeah.
Great question. Yeah. Thank you both. Another round of applause for Michele and Ron. Thank you so much.